start? All right.
Yeah, get all this conversation.
Yeah, we're gonna say that.
I'm taking stuff from that.
Sorry, I'm running a few minutes behind here. This is what happens when we schedule back-to-back appointments all afternoon long and get a little behind schedule. So welcome back, and tonight our main topic is to think a little bit about topics that are researchable. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to develop a research question. And I'll give you kind of an example of that from my dissertation that I mentioned back in our first session. We're going to talk a little bit about ideas not only for things that you're working on now, that may be projects that you're already developing with an advisor, but other things that might help other people in the room to think about ideas that they may be writing about or researching about. And we'll go from there. So I mentioned the first time we got together about when I wrote my thesis for my doctorate, and I had kind of an interesting research question that came up with my students. I had been teaching this honors 8th grade math class at the time for 5 years. Amazingly now, this is my 25th year of teaching the class. So you can see how far back in time this was. This was about the time you were being born. So I was teaching this class, and I kept thinking about what was really going on there. I was curious about why my students would want to take that kind of a class. So it's kind of, I think a lot of times research that we do comes from those curiosities, or where you start to wonder, is that teaching strategy that I'm using really that effective? Or why would a person want to do this? Or what's the effect of doing this with a class? And as soon as you get a question in your head that you start to wonder about, you've all of a sudden got kind of the seed of some kind of a research study. And so I'm looking at these kids in my class, and I'm thinking, these guys, girls, they're working really hard. I mean, they're coming in before school. They're coming at 7:30 in the morning before school. It's a 0-hour class. The rest of the school doesn't start to arrive until a little after 8:30. And so they're working really hard, and they're coming in early in the morning to take the class. So why would they actually want to do that? So once I kind of had that curiosity about the class that I was teaching, I started to figure out what research questions I wanted to ask. So the last time we were together, we talked about kind of defining a research problem and then trying to figure out what does the literature say, right? Doing that literature review, what has of other people already figured out about that. So I came up with a list of 5 questions that I was curious about. And again, when you think about your research, you think in general kind of about a topic, and then you start thinking, well, what are the questions that I have within that topic? So one of my questions was, what are the career goals of those students? Because I'm thinking maybe there's something in common there that most of them are thinking about going into, and that's why they feel it's important for them to be in this kind of accelerated or honors 8th grade class. Secondly, who influenced their decision to take the course? Was it pretty much the student's decision on his or her own? Or were the parents involved there? Did the teacher from last year push them to take the class? Why are they in there in the first place? Thirdly, when and why did they decide to take the class, and what was that decision-making process like? Is this something that they've been planning to do ever since they were in 4th grade, and their parents have been kind of pushing in that direction? Or the day before schedules were due, did they suddenly decide, hey, I want to be in this class with my friends? What's that look like? What's the decision-making process look like? What are their attitudes and behaviors in terms of studying math? So what is it that sets these students apart? What do they like when they're in the classroom? And then to what degree do their attitudes and dispositions, the National Council of Teachers of Math put out this document on dispositions. They said that students who are pretty good at math tend to be students that have a lot of confidence. They tend to recognize the value of learning math and applying it to the real world. They tend to be people who are curious, and they're very interested in math. So I'm kind of looking at all that stuff and saying, really, this group of kids who are taking the class, are they that curious? Are they that interested? Do they have perseverance when they solve problems? What do these kids actually look like? So I came up with these 5 questions and decided there's a lot of data gathering that I could do to try to answer my questions. So this is what Dr. Bostic and I are working on right now. We're working on a research paper. Actually, it's done. We just submitted it earlier this week. And he and I were asking some research-related questions about action, in fact. And I had about 2 or 3 research questions I was interested in. We gathered some data. We crunched the numbers and wrote about it. And the whole idea of the research paper is how can we systematically go about answering those questions? What do we find out? So here's what I decided to do. I started out with 200, 220 something like that students, and I gave them all a survey. I asked them in the survey, and I took this random sample of kids all over the place, and they're all in Ohio. And I asked them questions about, what class are you in this year, why did you take it, what career areas are you interested in? On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you to learn math? How confident are you in your problem-solving abilities? How confident are you that you'll do as well this year in your class as you did last year in your class, and all that kind of thing. I asked them a whole bunch of questions and tried to kind of compile all of those surveys. Then, I mentioned to you in our first session that out of all of those schools that I gave surveys in, I selected 4 of them, and I went in to observe in 4 of those schools. So I actually wanted to see these 8th graders at work. I know what my students look like. I wondered what kids look like in other classes and with other teachers. And so I selected 4 schools to go in and observe. And so I went in over the course of a couple of months, and I observed those students on a regular basis to watch what they were doing in class. I took all kinds of field notes about their behaviors. I wrote down examples of questions that they asked during class and whether they seemed to be on task and all that kind of stuff. I wrote all kinds of notes down about what I saw. And then from each one of those schools, I selected 6 students per school for a total of 24, and I interviewed them in some depth. And I talked to each one of those kids. I sat down and asked them a list of questions that were pre-planned. Exactly, I asked them some questions about their experiences and what drives you crazy about a math class, and what do you like most about your math teacher, and all that kind of thing. Ask them all kinds of pointed questions to gather data, just to kind of get into their heads a little bit and think about what they think about math classes and about their teachers. I learned a lot. It's kind of an interesting thing when you get them one-on-one like that. I was also curious to know what their parents thought. So once I interviewed those 24 kids, I called their parents and did a phone interview with each one of their parents. And I collected that data. So I kind of asked the parents some of the same questions. Remember what we called that? The word that I tried to review once, but it wasn't actually a review at all. Yeah, very good. Who said that? Corinne, good job. Triangulate the data, right? So triangulating the data. So here we go. So I'm looking at this and saying, all right, it's one thing for the student to say, the reason I'm in this class is because mom pushed me and told me that I have to take this class. But then I'm really curious to talk to mom. Is that what she's going to say? And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm looking at the student in class and how they're behaving, and then I'm asking them questions about their behavior, and then I want to find out what their parents' perspective are on this, so that I can put all of those pieces together and see if there was a consistency. And sure enough, sometimes that was the case. I took the class because mom pushed me to take it, and she told me I had to. And you talk to mom, why is your daughter in the math class? Because I told her she had to take it. Oh, interesting. Okay, so you're all saying the same thing. Now, why did you think it was so important for her to take the class? And then we got into that discussion. So again, it's all about data. I'm gathering all kinds of information about what's going on here. And then I went into the permanent records of those students. And I went through their files, and I looked to see their grades in other classes and how good their scores were on standardized tests. Reading, were their reading scores consistent with their math scores? Sometimes you have students that are really good readers, but they're bad at math, or vice versa. I wanted to know what kind of a record those students had academically. And then, as a side piece, I had conversations with the principal of each school and the teachers. I didn't do formal interviews with them, but I asked them a lot of questions about things they do in their classes. And in the end, I had a ton of data, right? All kinds of data. I had 200 surveys in a stack, and I had all of these interview notes, and I had all of these interview notes, and all of these records, and so forth. And then my job was to start to sift through that and say, what patterns do I see? What kind of consistency, what kind of things have I learned? And can I actually answer the 5 questions that I originally posed based on all this data that I've gathered? And so in the end, it took me a little over a year to collect and analyze the data. I ended up with a 246-page paper, and I developed what I read for you the first time we were together for 3160, which was that composite student of what a typical student in a math class looks like. And I came to that conclusion by analyzing all of that data. Okay? What did the data look like? A lot of the data were written on Post-it notes. And I would go through and type up an interview, and I would take a Post-it note with a comment that a student made, and I'd put that on the wall. And then I'd take a comment that a parent said, and I'd say, hey, that's similar to what that student said, and I'd stick that on the wall. I had this whole wall, literally, that was filled with Post-it notes. I'll never forget that process. I actually did it at my in-laws' house, and I think that's how I was able to get this done. That I moved in with them temporarily. They had a third floor in their house that was completely vacant. I went in, I holed up in that house. The only thing I did was come down for meals 3 times a day. Otherwise, that was just me in that room, day and night for, I don't even know how long it was. I've sort of lost track. But anyway, trying to put all those pieces together and make sense of it and figure out what are the patterns here so I could figure out what to write about. Okay? So, my project here was a lot bigger in scope than the one that you're going to do, right? But the principles are exactly the same. If you think about it, it's, I've got a problem I'm trying to research. I'm going to make up a few questions, a couple questions I'm going to try to answer. I'm going to gather a bunch of data. I'm going to analyze the data, draw some conclusions I'm going to write about it. And that's what research is all about. You do the exact same thing. All right? So action research specifically is really important for us because it allows us to be able to kind of systematically analyze a problem or a situation in education. And we're not just drawing conclusions on what we can or should be doing based on a gut feeling. We're doing it because we've actually gathered some data and analyzed it and drawn some conclusions. So what I'd like for you to think about is, I know in the room right now we've got a lot of different places. Some of you have got a pretty well-defined research area that you're interested in. You've been working with on it with an advisor. And others in the room just really don't know what you want to write about yet. And we're kind of from A to Z, and that's okay, because we don't need to worry too much about that. On the other hand, what I'd like to get us to surface in the next little bit here are some examples of research areas, or at least issues in education, that you think would be really good and researchable. Either something you're already in the middle of, or something you've thought about that you haven't really broken ground on, but it would be an interesting topic to study. So here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to start this process off by put a few of these post-it notes on each table. And I'd like for you to each take a couple of post-it notes. I want you to do at least 2. You can do 3 if you're not sure what to do, or if you got several ideas. But what I'd like for you to do is take a post-it note and write on that note an idea or an issue in education that you're interested in, that you think might make an interesting and researchable type of topic. Anything you can think of in your content area or education in general that you think would be an interesting area that you might research. It can be one you're already working on now. It could be one that you're not working on but you think might be interesting anyway. What I'd like for you to do first right now is you take a couple of minutes right now at your table. Just go around and everybody share what you wrote down so you know what everybody else at your table put on their post-its. We can all have chances at our tables to share a little bit. Let's do this. I'd like for you to bring your post-it notes to the front of the room, and we're going to put them on the whiteboard here, but organized kind of into groups. So when you bring your post-its up, if you find somebody else in the room had one that was very similar to or related to yours, try to organize them together with those so that we kind of have a sense of big topics that you've written about. So I'm going to turn this off here so we got the whole whiteboard. The only thing I will warn you about before you do that is that there are 2 cords here, a power cord for the computer and for the overhead. We have no insurance for action, so you have to make sure that you don't trip over the cord. So when you come up, if you find other ones that are like yours, try to put them together and organize them up here.